Can you hear me in the back? Perfect. Okay, so again, my name is Bret Little. I hope this is a worthwhile talk. This may be a slight bait and switch, but really on the same lines as far as my description, just a little bit different take. And I'm really hoping as well through this talk to hopefully just inspire you all a little bit about the way the browser works, what's coming, and maybe inspire you to maybe think up and dream up what the next generation sort of libraries and frameworks can do. Like I'm not going to present some crazy new framework or crazy new thing. I'm just going to show you some really nitty-gritty internals of how the browser works, historically, down to how it works with new stuff coming down the pipe. And based upon that, hopefully also you can maybe dream up some really cool things that you can do with these new technologies. So that said, again, my name is Bret Little, though. I work at a company called Canopy Tax. We are hiring if you are interested in diving deep into this kind of stuff. We have a couple members at Canopy who've contributed to Core System JS, other major projects. And so if you're excited about it, come talk to me afterwards. To start off too, I'm going to take this just a moment to recognize that actually today, this whole next week is a global climate strike. And so just bringing awareness to climate change throughout the world. Just want to take a minute, center on that. So, modules. I'm going to start off this talk with probably the most like scientific-ish definition maybe you want to hear all day about a module. So a module, a standalone piece of code. Okay, yeah, a module, standalone piece of code, tightly coupled functionality, defines logical boundaries inside your application. Okay, what does that actually mean? Well, modules inside JavaScript have a long history. Way back in the day, the really only way you could do modules inside JavaScript is via a function. This is called the revealer module pattern. Who here has seen code like this in JavaScript? This maybe is really familiar for some of you. Essentially what this is doing is we have this immediately invoked function that's being assigned to my module. Inside that, we're returning an object with a method in it. You can also have private data. The only reason you can have private data in JavaScript is because of the function. But this public method being returned has access via a closure, that private data. Like for encapsulating functionality, this was the only really way to do it in JavaScript for years and years and years. And like we came up with all sorts of fancy ways to do modules, like we'd like have 50 files maybe, like we put script tag, script tag, script tag on the HTML, all pointing to different modules, and you got to do it in just the right order, so you finally get to the last one and your app will run. That really sucked. Eventually, though, like things kind of evolved a little bit, and there's new technologies that were developed, specifically AMD. Who here has heard of AMD? Okay, yeah, so AMD was kind of a step forward in evolution of modules in JavaScript. Rather than having this like weird sort of thing here, like how do you define dependencies between these? If you have like lots of these modules, that can get kind of hard. But with AMD, you can define dependencies very nicely. I can say, here, define this module called hello. It doesn't depend upon anything. That's the second sort of parameter with the array. This other one below, define app, it does depend upon hello. And it gets the hello module as a parameter in the function of its definition. And now inside that, it can call hello.getGreeting and console log that. This is kind of how AMD worked back in the day. Don't worry too much about the syntax. Require.js is actually the technology, the premier one that implemented AMD, this specification. But like this was like premier for years. This was like super, like this was the hot stuff. This is how you do modules in JavaScript for a period of time. And like this was your main sort of start thing at the bottom. And like back in the day too, like we came up with these cool sort of what we called bundlers, but they really weren't bundlers. There was Gulp and Grunt.js. Who's heard of those? Yeah, so those things essentially would take maybe all of your source directory, every JavaScript file, and concatenate them into one big massive file, potentially of these defined statements. Once they're all defined, I can have a main sort of require to start the whole thing, and it just runs. It was great, right? Well, you know, there's some issues with that because like I'm kind of hinting at here even files. Usually, a lot of times, we kind of think of modules correlated to files. I intentionally have double equal because we're coercing, you know, a file to equal a module, but maybe it isn't always. But like oftentimes, we actually do want to encapsulate functionality in a file. So it might be worth talking about how in the browser, if you want to load more code, how would you do that? Well, historically, again, the only way to load more JavaScript in the browser is to use this whole other language called HTML. Can you think of any other language out there, like Python or anything, where it requires you to use a wholly other language just to import and add more code? Just kind of weird, like where JavaScript came from. Well, you can eval. So technically, you could like make a network request to another file and eval the code. But we all know like eval's evil, we shouldn't be using eval. Well, maybe you could just generate a script tag and set the inner text of that script tag to some string. Now I'm not really evaling, so now I feel better about myself, but I'm appending this to the DOM. Well, that's kind of weird though. This is still a hack, essentially. This is a hack to like load extra code in the browser. And it's kind of weird. In the meantime, there's this thing called Node.js that came up. I'm sure all of you have heard of it. Node.js introduced CommonJS. This is a whole new standard of defining modules, specifically for Node that runs on the desktop. The cool thing about Node, though, is they could implement this require statement natively without any hacks and allow you to say require some other file and execute some stuff from it. That's pretty cool stuff. Like that, this was revolutionary when Node came out, allowing you to actually have modules and encapsulate code in files. This was really, really awesome stuff. There's a couple problems, though, that CommonJS had, maybe still has, and also like even AMD has. Specifically, one, it's not really standard. There's no require in the browser. That's not a real thing. Somebody made Node.js and they just invented that. That's not an actual standard. That's not implemented. You can maybe build a hack for it, but it's not standard. Same thing with AMD. Like that itself is not standard. Also, probably the bigger one here, you can only export one thing. So when I say you can only export one thing, exports.foobar right here. Whenever I require this file, I'm getting everything that that file is exporting, whether I want to or not. It becomes very difficult for you to like dead code remove or tree shake based upon CommonJS, because I can like reflectively like look at properties on foobar dynamically. And like, that just, it makes it really difficult for the JavaScript engine to actually optimize this code and say, what are you actually using? And the same thing with AMD. Also, you get really weird circular dependency issues because, again, of the way this stuff is defined. You can solve circular dependency issues, but you still have them inherently with these module designs. So, lo and behold, ES6 modules. Everybody's probably, well, maybe I'll take who here is using ES6 modules in their code right now? Great, that's pretty cool. I'm not going to ask the people who are not using ES6 modules. I apologize for wherever you're working. But ES6 modules are awesome. This is really cool. This is a new syntax. It's standard. Also, not only is this standard, the whole point of like, you can actually export more than one thing. And because these are evaluated statically, if I never import foo from this other file, the compiler, when it executes this, can know that I'm never actually using that function. There's no way for me to get at it in this other file other than the imports. And so the JavaScript engine can be very smart about optimizing your code. So that's pretty awesome. So let's talk about that static imports, though. I want to quiz you all. Not to make you feel dumb, maybe you'll get this immediately. But we have 3 files here. Here is this module at the bottom. This is our HTML file. We're saying script type module. We're going to import file 1 and then console log something. Import file 1 at the top, console log, import file 2. So my question is, do you think the bottom one's going to print out in that order on the right, or is it going to be the top one that's going to be printed out in that order? Maybe this is like a WAT moment for like JavaScript, like WAT, what the heck is it doing? I don't really know what's going on. So who thinks it's going to be the first one? Who thinks it's going to be the second one? And who's just terrified to vote? Okay, well, perfect. So let's talk through it. So when I say it's static imports, the import itself needs to be evaluated before the code can be evaluated. So when you look inside this module at the bottom here, we cannot execute console log hello until we evaluate the import. And this is essential to the way the specification works. So before we can console log, we need to evaluate file 1. We come up here to file 1. Before we can evaluate console log world, we must evaluate file 2. So we go to file 2. Then we print out get ready. So actually, it's the first one. The first thing printed out is get ready. Then we pop up the import stack to this file 1, log world, and then once that's imported, we can log hello. Does that make sense? Static imports. This is how your code's working right now if you're using ES6 modules. You have to statically resolve all the imports before your code can actually execute. Now here's a question. Who here is natively running ES6 modules in the browser? Like I say, natively, you're not using Babel to compile them. Is anybody for your app? Nobody. Nobody is running this natively in the browser. Did you realize this standard came out in 2015? That is almost 5 years ago that this was defined. That is crazy. And nobody is running this natively in the browser. And also, global support for this, outside of Internet Explorer 11, every browser supports this. Right now, supports it. So that's 86, 87% global usage. If you're just here in the United States, it's even higher than that. So my question maybe just to think, I'm not looking for an answer really, maybe, why is nobody actually using these natively? So ES6 modules come with more than just static imports. They also have dynamic imports. So dynamic imports are a little bit different. So in this file on the right, I can essentially say import foobar. If I say instead of like just saying import space quote foobar, but instead I call import as a function, that import is going to evaluate and produce a promise. And then at some point in the future, that promise is going to resolve, and I'm going to have the data that's exported from this other file, which is very different than a static import. A static import needs to be resolved before any of your code goes, whereas this happens at runtime. So let's go back to this first problem I gave you. Now if we change file 1 to be a dynamic import instead of a static import, what's the order of this console log stuff? It's a little bit different now. Just to talk through this really quick, so if we look at the bottom one, okay, it's everything we did before. We're not going to console log hello until import file 1's resolved. Go to file 1. Well, this is not a static import. We're just going to start lazily importing a second file, and then we're going to proceed. So immediately after hello, or immediately the first thing logged is going to be world. And then after world is logged, immediately hello is going to be logged. And then at some time in the future, that import statement is going to resolve. But before it can resolve, it needs to also get file 2. So then file 2, get ready is logged, and then dynamic. Is that really confusing? Maybe slightly. This is just the difference between dynamic imports and static imports and how they work. So dynamic imports has a similar sort of global support. It's about it's like maybe 2 or 3% less because like almost nobody uses Edge. But with the new version of Edge coming out that is based on Chromium, you'll also be able to use that. So essentially, this is available too, like for most of us right now. But there's a lot more really cool stuff coming down the pipe when it comes to modules. And some of this stuff, I think, is why not many people use native modules yet, is because there's really cool stuff that's coming. So one specifically I want to mention is import maps. One of the problems with ES modules right now is there's no way for you just to say import moment from moment, or import underscore from Lodash, or import React from React. There's really no way to do that. But with import maps, this is a new specification that's defined that is currently available in Chrome, newest versions of Chrome, behind a flag. But it is available, or it's going to be becoming available. And the whole point of it is you can define a JSON map that maps my module to an actual location. And now throughout your code, you don't need to say like import some actual file. You could just say import React or import moment directly. And this is what will resolve it to that location. And you can also just do a reference to an actual JSON file remotely. These are really cool too, because you can also do like fallback requests. So you can essentially say, when I import jQuery, I first want to go to this CDN, and if the CDN does not work, or it's not available, then actually load it from my locally hosted site. And you can have lots of these sort of fallback things if you want. Import maps are also really cool because it kind of can abstract away like the way we do cache busting with our apps. So imagine you have like your app that you want to load. Well, it's located at this CDN with this unique URL, and whenever we redeploy this application, we're just going to deploy a new version of this JavaScript file with a new hash on there. Well, anybody downstream doesn't need to know about that hash. That resolution can be defined once in an import map, and then all you have to do is say import app. Or somewhere deep inside the dependency here, or inside app.js, we can also say import from dep. And if you're using native ES6 modules, all of that will resolve properly, which is really, really cool. Also, import maps allow you to do like really cool new stuff coming down the pipe as well. And this is just an example. KV storage is a built-in web module that is a current proposed specification that was briefly implemented in Chrome as an experiment, and they're getting feedback on it. But the point is, instead of like adding a new browser API as a global, we can add an actual API that's like a standard JavaScript library that's always available. And this particular one, KV storage, is meant to wrap IndexedDB and look a lot like local storage, except use IndexedDB instead of local storage and be asynchronous. So that's pretty cool. But then the necessity of import maps to do this in the first place, what happens if you want to use this standard library thing, but it doesn't yet exist in your browser? Well, without import maps, there's no way to do that. But with import maps, you could actually define your own like version of it as a polyfill, mapping to your own implementation instead of using what doesn't exist in the browser. Or if it does exist in the browser, use what's native. But if you want to learn more about KV storage, you can check it out. There's a link in here. I can share the slides later. There's other really cool stuff coming with modules as well. There's JSON modules. We talked about importing JavaScript. Why not be able to import actual JSON statically inside your file? Or even a dynamic import. Right now, you cannot do that in the browser. You can't do this in any browser at the moment. But this is another specification. You can read more about it here that is coming down the pipe. This is really cool, again, because you can just say, import some JSON, and before my code will execute, I'm going to have that JSON and have it available, which is awesome. Well, also, if you can import JSON, why not also be able to import HTML? Like from your script type module, why not be able to say import content from an actual like HTML file? And this specification is not available yet in the browser. This is also still being defined, being talked about, but is really exciting because, again, when you say import from HTML, what it's going to provide for you is actually parsed DOM nodes. And once you have those DOM nodes, you can just append them to the DOM and do whatever you want with them, which is really, really cool. But it can also be a lot more advanced than that. Like I put this together as like a simple React example. I could import this whole HTML file and get the DOM nodes out and append them to the body. But inside here, could have a script tag in it as well. Inside here, I could have the div at the top. I could have script module. I can import React, React DOM. I in theory, could. React and React DOM actually don't produce ES modules yet natively. Like you have to have another like wrapper sort of thing for it. But at some point, they will. But then after that, I can query out of the local HTML the actual ID of the element above that's scoped to this HTML file. And then below, I can like manually call react.createElement because I'm not putting JSX inside here. And then eventually react.dom.render inside our local HTML file. And now we can export that out. That's all in memory, but anybody now that actually requires it has that, and they can append it to the DOM, which is really cool. Like this is a whole new thing that can enable all sorts of stuff. You could, and the resolution works very nested. Like inside an HTML file, you could import another HTML file that could import another HTML file. These modules work exactly the way you would expect any module to work. So if I can import HTML files, why not also be able to import CSS files? So this is another native specification as well being defined to natively import CSS. So if you look inside this code here, it's exactly like the previous example, except I also say import styles from app.css. And this is the CSS file over here. You know, dark salmon, Rebecca purple. Those are standard HTML5 color codes, FYI. But once we import that, we can define a shadow root. We can append those to the DOM. Those are parsed style sheets. And when I say parsed style sheets, you don't need to do any parsing yourself. The browser has actually parsed those. You now have them. You can assign them to the shadow DOM. You can assign them to the root DOM. You can do whatever you want, which is really, really cool. But at the end of the day, all of these things you cannot use right now. These things are exciting. They're really cool. They're coming down the pipe. I really want you to think about like maybe what you could do with them. But there's a project called System.js. System.js actually is kind of like a polyfill for all of this. With System.js right now in the browser, you can run almost all of these modules, and it works. And to give you a simple example of that, so this is what it would look like with System.js. Here's our import map at the top. Instead of it just saying import map, we have to say System.js-import map. Beyond that, everything inside here is exactly the same. With JavaScript dependency, JSON dependency, CSS dependency, HTML dependency. And then inside of our code, we can say system.import any of those things instead of just import, and it will work as you expect and be awesome. I say that with a small caveat. HTML imports is not fully implemented yet. There's an open PR right now for System.js. A guy actually here in the audience wrote that PR, and so I'm feeling slightly like I got to make sure I'm saying this accurately. That has not landed quite yet, but everything else works right now in System.js. And some real-world examples. I just want to show you a few real-world examples. Specifically, here's one example. This is a local company called Jump. Who here has heard of Jump? Yeah, it's a local company. If I view the page source of this, check this out. In production right now, let me zoom in a little bit. I do not work for Jump either. Full disclosure. Keep scrolling down. Check this out. Import map right here, where they have React and React DOM pointing to a CDN. So they clearly use React for their application, and they're using import maps inside here for it. Also inside here, like as you can see, there's going to be system.import. He's right here, which is really cool. So right now, Jump is using, and for Jump to switch over, the moment like Edge or there's a certain critical mass of browsers supporting import maps, for them to switch over to the native specification, all it will take for them to do is come in here, delete out that system dot, come up here to their import maps, remove the System.js, remove System.js as a dependency, maybe make a few more minor modifications, and then boom, immediately this company will be reusing native ES modules, import maps, all these things in their application, which is really, really awesome. So beyond that, like I really want to focus on what's next. Like I just showed you CSS modules. Right now in the browser, that you can't do that, but coming soon, you're going to be able to actually import a CSS file into your JavaScript. Like what sorts of things would you build differently in Angular, in Vue, in React if you had that capability? What about HTML? Like you could import actual DOM nodes natively in the browser. What would you do differently with your frameworks if you could do that? Like I remember 5, 6, 7 years ago, before React was around, before Angular, the newer versions of Angular, before AngularJS was around, like nobody had dreamed up what our current frameworks are. And we live in a much better situation than what life was like back then as a front-end dev. But my point is in bringing that up, we couldn't imagine where the world is today. And the technology is changing rapidly. And I just want to inspire and hopefully encourage you guys or you all to learn about this stuff and experiment with it. Learn about it, play with it, and try to define what are the next frameworks and technologies going to be in the future. Because none of them take advantage of this right now. And this stuff is going to be coming, and it's going to be awesome. But that's all I have.